Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Siobhan Carroll and I will be your host today. Thanks for joining. For those of you who don't know, Enterprise Health is a healthcare focused cybersecurity firm. We're the longest tenured certified HITRUST assessor with extensive experience in the NIST cybersecurity framework. We provide privacy, security, HIPAA compliance, and HITRUST services. I'd like to introduce our presenters. Ryan Patrick is Enterprise Health Senior Vice President of Security Services. He has over 20 years of healthcare IT and security experience across multiple security frameworks. A cybersecurity expert, Ryan brings an innovative perspective to protecting information and organizational resources. Ryan has been Battalion Commander at the United States Army Reserve since April 2017. His previous military assignments include serving as Global Enterprise Operations Center Chief for the U.S. Special Operations, Chief Information Officer of 42nd Infantry Division within the New York Army National Guard, as a Deputy Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Officer of FEMA Region 2 Homeland Response Force. Melissa Hawkins is our next presenter. Melissa is a seasoned healthcare IT security program manager with more than 20 years of experience over a broad range of IT and business functions, including software implementation, agile development methodology, project and program management, product management, and computers. Melissa holds a seat on the HITRUST Assessor Council. We're going to do interactive polls during today's presentation, and we hope you will take a chance to answer them as we're talking, and we will show the responses on the screen. This will also help Melissa and Ryan in terms of the content that they're presenting.
So welcome everybody. I'm really happy to have everybody joining us here today. Looks like the poll just came up. So if you could respond to that really quickly, as Siobhan mentioned, it will help Melissa and I kind of tailor the content based on the audience. It's helpful to us and kind of moving forward through the presentation. We're going to have a number of those polls, so I encourage everybody to interact with those as much as possible. Additionally, this is designed to be more of a Q&A than a lecture. So we're really hoping that questions from you all as we're presenting some of the content will be thrown out there. We'd love to answer them. So do not hesitate to put any questions in the question box. We'll answer them in real time or when it makes sense in the presentation. We also received a bunch of questions from the registration period that we're going to weave into this presentation as well. So we're really hoping to be collaborative. So do not hesitate. I encourage you. You're not going to offend us if you want to throw a really tough question out there. Nothing's off the table. So the results just came in. We have, looks like most people are familiar. A couple of people are completely unfamiliar. So that's really helpful to us. What I'd like to start off doing is talking about kind of the HITRUST CSF overall, and then we'll dig into some of the weeds. So generally, the HITRUST CSF is a framework of really frameworks, to be honest. It is a framework built on top of other frameworks. So its baseline is ISO 27001, which Melissa will dig into a little bit in a future slide. But it also incorporates a lot of other frameworks that you may be familiar with, whether it's PCI, the NIST CSF, control sets from NIST 800-53, lots of state level regulations and laws, and even international with things like GDPR. So just, right off the cuff, the benefits of HITRUST is you're getting a framework and you are building your security and privacy program to really apply no matter where you're doing business and who you're doing business with, because HITRUST, it touches every facet of an organization, but it's scaled to really be tailored to any industry. It was born out of healthcare, but what the HITRUST Alliance, the governing body, has done is they've kind of healthcare-ified it, so to speak, and they've made it industry agnostic. So whether you're crossing over different verticals or you're in one specific vertical, it really applies to all. And what it does for you is it gives you you as the assessed organization, the one that's looking to get certified, it gives you that roadmap, right? So for those of you who are familiar with HIPAA and the HIPAA security rule, the biggest complaint, the chief complaint, is it was very vague. You know, what am I supposed to do to meet these administrative and technical requirements? HITRUST is way more prescriptive. It's going to give you that kind of that roadmap to say, hey, you need to put these types of controls in place. But the real genius behind it is that the certification is not the end goal. And this is going to be one of those foot stomping, you know, topics throughout the presentation. Is the whole point, at least for me, is for you to adopt the CSF, to adopt the framework, make it a part of your daily operations. Because if you are, it makes your certification, which everybody thinks is the end goal, that much easier, because you're doing the work a little bit every day, as opposed to trying to sprint in the last month or so, trying to get everything, you know, finished before you hit submit or you try to recertify. So what it does is it takes a look at your organization, your business model. It takes a look at your risk profile, and it builds kind of a custom assessment for you in which you will demonstrate your compliance against, so that if you want to do business with a bunch of other people or a bunch of other organizations, you can actually take the HITRUST report and certification and hand it to them and say, hey, look at all the great things that I'm doing from a security and privacy perspective. The days of having to answer, you know, a couple hundred security questionnaires from different business partners a year, you know, really has come to an end, because the kind of the mantra for HITRUST is assess once, report many. Because HITRUST is really all encompassing from a security and privacy perspective, it's going to touch every facet of your organization. And we're going to demonstrate that in a future slide. There really isn't anything that's left uncovered. And it's so rigorous that it's hard to kind of fake the funk. It's hard to pretend like you're doing something, because it's 100% a trust but verify type of assessment and certification, in the sense of you will attest to the things that are in place, but then you're required to bring in a third party like Enterprise, who then validates that what you said is in place is actually in place before you can ever get certified. So it gives you a higher level of assurance than a lot of other certifying frameworks or regulations or even laws. So I'll pause there for a second. Melissa, anything to add? I saw one question come in. I didn't know if it was relevant, Siobhan.
It was about SOC 2.
Okay.
The difference between HITRUST and SOC 2.
Okay, actually, you know what? I'll take that one now, because I was talking about levels of assurance. I think this is really important, because this question comes up a lot. You know, what is better, HITRUST or SOC 2, or what's the difference between HITRUST and SOC 2? And there are a lot of similarities. In fact, the AICPA and HITRUST Alliance have a partnership where they will rely on each other's work to get the other side, you know, the path moving forward. So if you've done a SOC 2, you can take a lot of that SOC 2 work and apply it to HITRUST and vice versa. The chief difference is that, and it's going to sound really self-serving since this is what I do day in and day out, but HITRUST really gives you a higher level of assurance in your security and privacy program. And it gives your business partners, probably more importantly, a higher level of assurance. And what I mean by that is they can be assured that what you are saying is in place actually is there and it's functioning, right? So we're going to take 3 different scenarios. Your traditional security risk assessment. For those of you working in healthcare, mandated by HIPAA, you have to do these things. What happens is you either do it yourself, you will run through your organization, be assessing risk, or you hire someone to come in, they assess risk. They may, or the report is only as good as the person doing it, really. Now we'll talk about SOC 2. SOC 2, the organization will actually have a third party come in, a CPA firm, and they will do an assessment based on the criteria laid out within SOC 2. There's really 2 levels of assurance when it comes to that assessment. The first is that the organization being assessed their executive management team has to sign a letter saying that everything in the assessment and everything in the report is accurate and it's true, meaning it's there, it's functioning, it's working, yada, yada, yada. Then the second level of assurance is that AICPA firm will come in and they will also attest that these things are in place. Whereas with HITRUST, the assurance goes a lot deeper. Similarly to SOC 2, HITRUST requires the management team to attest that it's all accurate, it's true, it's factual. The third-party assessor firm, external assessor as it's called, like Enterprise, has to come in and validate everything that the organization is doing. And it's not just taking your policies and your procedures and saying, oh, yep, you're good to go. We are required to go through with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that they actually meet the requirements at the different maturity levels. But we also have to test. So we're actually going in and doing testing in these environments to make sure that it's actually there. We collect evidence to support the scores and the comments that we put in. So that's right there, 2 levels of assurance. I'm required as the practice lead for Enterprise for HITRUST by the HITRUST Alliance to send every assessment that we do through an internal QA process that is separate and aside from the folks who did the actual assessment. So I have a completely separate team take a look at that assessment and QA it to make sure that we haven't missed anything, that the evidence makes sense, the scope makes sense, before we can ever even submit it to the HITRUST Alliance. Once it's submitted to the HITRUST Alliance, it goes through another QA process from the HITRUST Alliance. So now we're at 4 levels of assurance. 4 different entities have touched this assessment. So it goes through that QA process. There's a lot of back and forth normally between the external assessor like Enterprise and the HITRUST Alliance QA team. Once that gets through that QA process, the last step is it goes through a compliance review within HITRUST. So 5 levels of assurance, 5 people, 5 entities, teams are looking at that one assessment to make sure that if they say this control is in place and it's at the appropriate maturity level, that it's actually there. So if you're a consumer of that certification report, you can feel really, really comfortable that this organization that you're about to do business with is doing some good things with security and privacy. So those are to me, the biggest differences between SOC 2 and HITRUST. The controls are, I don't want to, they're not exactly the same. They're looking at the same areas, but it's the rigor of getting through that assessment that I think is different between the 2 assessments. And again, it sounds very self-serving, but I think HITRUST comes out on top. So hopefully that answers that question. Melissa, we've been talking forever now. Anything that I missed?
I don't think so. Not yet.
All right.
And Ryan,
So,
Ryan, we should point out that we do work on SOC 2 with a partner. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And none of my comments are designed to say that SOC 2, there isn't merit and it isn't worth the effort. It absolutely is. Sure. 100% it is. And a lot of organizations are actually required to demonstrate compliance to both. And to your point, Siobhan, we offer that as a service as well because we see the merit in that. I was just specifically tackling, the question because there are some differences, but thank you for reminding me.
Yeah.
So really quickly, want to talk about kind of the certification life cycle. And we're going to get into the actual assessment. Melissa's going to tackle that piece here in a second, but keeping it at a high level, there's several steps that HITRUST requires to happen. And then there's several steps that we as Enterprise have determined make a certification journey more successful. So really there's kind of 2 steps mandated by HITRUST. There's a readiness assessment, which you'll see on the slide is represented in phase 2. And then there's a validation, which is in phase 4. Those 2 steps are the only things that really need to happen before you submit for certification to the HITRUST Alliance as the governing body. They're the ones that issue the certification. Enterprise does not. What we've realized, because we've been doing this 10 plus years now. HITRUST came out in 2009. We've been doing it since 2011. I personally been doing it since 2013. Melissa's been doing it 5 years or so. We have a lot of experience with doing this type of work. And what we've realized is that we need to, it seems like we're elongating the process, but what we're doing is putting in steps to make sure that those 2 required steps are done right and they're done appropriately, because if we miss it, then we may have to go back and do some rework. So the first thing we start off with is phase 1, which is scoping. And this is another foot stomping takeaway for anybody who's taking notes. If I'm stomping my foot, it means it's going to be on the test. Scoping is the single most important aspect of the entire certification journey. If we do not get the scope right up front, we could get all the way down to the point where we are ready to submit, which could be 12 months later, and have to go back to the readiness assessment in phase 2 and have to do rework. That is really, really painful for everyone involved. So we take a very deliberate act in learning your business drivers. What is your business model? Why are you coming to get certified? Is there a specific reason? Is there a contract that says you need to get certified? Is there, potential business out there? What is bringing you to us to get this work done? Those are really important questions. We're going to build your risk profile in the web tool that HITRUST puts out for this whole process called My CSF. We generate the assessment. We all agree collectively, you as the assessed organization and us as the external assessors, we all agree that this is the scope. And we could really drill into scope, but I'm not going to do that here. We have some other webinars where we specifically focus on scope, where I'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, go to our website, check out the webinars about scoping, because scoping is really hard through the lens of HITRUST. And there's some kind of tidbits on what can be used to be successful in getting scoping done. So we get the scope done, we go into the readiness assessment. What we do at Enterprise is we will take your readiness assessment and we will score it as if we were validating you in step 4. And what we do is we say, hey, this is where you're compliant. This is where we say, if we were to validate you today, this is where you're good to go. Anywhere that you're not good to go, we're going to tell you, hey, you need to go do X, Y, and Z to become good to go and become compliant. So that's when we go into phase 3, which is remediation. And we're not going to say, hey, you have this 100 gaps, go fix all 100. HITRUST is scalable and flexible in the sense that it realizes that security isn't perfect. There's no such thing as being quote unquote secure. Environments change every single day. Threats change every single day. So you don't have to fix every single thing. You just have to fix certain things to get to a certifying state. And that's where we will help you prioritize your efforts. Because, and this is another foot stomping moment, this is a significant emotional event. This is not easy. This is not something that you've done before. I don't care if you've been through other certification paths. This is not easy. It's a lot of work, really, for everybody involved as an organization. But it's doable. And I guarantee you that you will be better on the back end. We literally have customers that throw parties when they get submitted and get certified, because that's how invested they become in this process. And that's how far they've come across the spectrum of security and privacy, that they get really passionate about it and they get really excited. And then they have to get back to work because it's all about adoption. So we send you into remediation. We help you through that process, help you make decisions on how to implement certain controls. If it requires technology, what technologies are considered compliant, things like that. Once that's done, we do another check. And we say, yes, you've done the things that you need to do to get certified. If we agree, we go into validation. That's the actual formal testing that we have to do, both on-site and remotely. Once that's complete, we submit to HITRUST. HITRUST will go through their QA process, as I mentioned. On the back end, you'll get certified. 12 months later, this is the great thing. This is, to me, the genius of HITRUST certification, is that it's really about adoption. I've said that a couple times now. You're kind of forced to think about HITRUST every day, or you're going to have a lot of work to do when you have to get to the interim assessment 12 months later, which is not as a heavy lift as the initial certification. It's really just kind of a sampling of your assessment to see what's changed, if anything. We get through that process, takes about 30 to 60 days. We recommend to HITRUST that you maintain your certification. They agree. Then you have another 12 months. And this is where this life cycle comes in. After that 12 months from the interim, which is 24 months from your original certification date, you actually have to recertify. So you're going to go through the whole process again. And this, again, this is that level of assurance that the HITRUST Alliance and the HITRUST certification provides, is it's not a one and done. Because technology is constantly changing, and because environments are constantly changing, including threats and risks, we need to look at it again and again and again. So that this loop here where you're going certification, interim, really just is continuous until you decide that you no longer have to do it, or for whatever reason, if the business changes. So again, I'll pause there. If there are no questions, I'll jump in. Melissa, you want to tackle what makes up the CSF?
Yep, sure. It does look like there's something in Q&A. Siobhan, is there a question?
Yeah, it's another question about SOC, so I figure we'll kind of wrap around with SOC as well.
Okay, perfect. So as Ryan stated, a big part of what we do is scoping. And in that phase, you're going to be identifying what regulatory factors drive your business, what systems that you need in scope. And essentially out of scoping, you'll end up with your set of requirement statements based off of the HITRUST framework. Potentially, there's a superset of about 1,900 requirements. If you had every single one included, you would have 19 requirement statements or controls. Typically, there's a subset, after scoping, you go through and you'll get a subset of those requirements, and they'll be organized into these 19 domains. That's HITRUST terminology. They're just basically subject areas. And again, as Ryan touched on, these subject areas, they span the entire organization. It's going to be IT, the IT department clearly is the most obvious area that it touches on. But it'll hit HR, it'll hit legal potentially, maybe procurement if your third-party management is handled through a procurement department, facilities, physical security. So as you can see, based on these subject areas or domains, as HITRUST calls them, it will touch every part of the organization. Are there any questions about domains or the subject areas? I know we typically get questions on overlap. We do see controls that are kind of a common thread across subject areas. But again, it's organized this way so that you can test and develop policy and procedures according to these subject areas and how they span the organization.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, Melissa mentioned there's up to 1,900 controls. Generally, in the assessments that we see, if you recall, I mentioned we will build a risk profile that happens in My CSF, the web-based portal. We typically see around 300 to 400 requirements, and you can equate the word requirement to controls.
Right.
For the average assessment size, yes, we've seen assessments balloon up to 800 or 900 and some as low as 250. But 300 to 400 is about where the sweet spot is on average if we're looking at it from a bell curve. And if we can go to the next slide, and I'm gonna pass it back to Melissa because I don't want to steal her thunder. But just a really important point to point out is every single one of those, let's say 300 requirements that you're subject to, the scope of your assessment, you're going to have to demonstrate compliance to these 5 levels of maturity. So that's when I say it's a significant emotional event, in that you're going to score for policy, you're going to score for process, you're going to score from implemented, so on and so forth. But you're also going to add comments. And then you're also going to provide evidence for each one of them. And maybe I just did steal all of Melissa's thunder.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's left to say, but so once you get your subset of requirements, the next step is the evaluation criteria. There's 5 different maturity levels. And again, it's ranges policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. And it's exponential. You know, for every requirement statement, we look at policy, and it can't just be, you know, we may do this. It has to be very explicit, strong policy language. Shall will language is something that HITRUST reinforces. It has to be approved. It has to be disseminated through the organization. It's not good enough to just have it sitting there. You have to show that your workforce is aware that these policies exist and you share it with them. It has to express management intent. You know, there's an entire scoring rubric that's based on this evaluation criteria that we're looking at. For example, if you have security and awareness training, you must have a policy stating that you're going to have a security and awareness training program. The next step would be, or the next evaluation criteria would be procedure. How do you do that training? Is it offered by HR during onboarding? You know, when is it offered? Who conducts the training? It's the who, what, and when part of the evaluation criteria. And then the next step is implemented. You have your policy saying you're going to do the training. You have your procedure that details the steps involved with conducting that training. And then the implemented evidence would be, do you have a log of who completed the training, the date the training was completed? How do you track that this control or requirement statement is implemented? When we test, we'll look at that evidence to see that it aligns. It's not even good enough to have evidence, but your evidence will need to align with your policy and procedure so that it reflects the actual steps that you documented. And then as your organization matures, you get into measured and managed. You know, how do you utilize maybe automated reports or a dashboard to track those training efforts, whether it be onboarding or recurring annual training? And then managed, you know, what action is taken to ensure continued compliance, or if there's gaps identified, you know, what does management do to remediate those? So, okay, so on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, Siobhan, back. I talked too long on the evaluation criteria. Can we back up one slide? Okay, so once you have all of that evaluation criteria, you're probably wondering, like, you know, how do we score based on that? We have the 5 maturity levels there, and the scoring rubric that I mentioned has different levels of scoring, and they increment in by 25, ranging from not compliant to 0% all the way up to fully compliant 100%. And as you can see, not all maturity levels are created equal. Not all of them carry the same weight. Policy being the least, implemented being the most. So it's important to have policy and process, but most importantly, and the heaviest weight gets devoted to the actual implemented control and the evidence that supports that.
Yeah, the one thing I would add here is Melissa's kind of highlighting, that red box is highlighting. There's a little bit of art to the science of this, in the sense of, and we're going to get into the actual scoring thresholds or the certifying thresholds in the next slide. But if you do the math on what's in the red box, that adds up to 75%. And I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtains on the next slide early, but you need a 72 to get certified. So if we're able to focus on those first 3 maturity levels and get 100% compliant, fully compliant on all 3 levels, we just got a 75. So we may not even need to look at measured or managed. So there's ways to reduce the effort by understanding kind of the science behind getting certified. So that's that art piece of, let's make a plan, let's prioritize, let's focus our efforts where we actually have to focus them in order to get certified.
So yeah, and I think this is important, as you just noted, Ryan, where it comes into play. You know, you don't have to fix everything. So this is where you may end up with a corrective action plan, or you know, ideally you get a 75 and that there's no corrective action plan. But what's important is that every domain is scored independently. So you only have to pass the domain as a whole and not individual requirement by requirement. So any questions on scoring? It can get a little tricky to understand passing and at the domain level, but there is an art to this.
We have the poll coming up next. Do you want to do that one?
Yep. So this one, if you're paying attention, I already kind of gave you the answer. So,
Exactly.
so we'll see how many people were paying attention. And
one person. There you
looks
go.
like at least 4 people paying attention. So this is what happens when you get me talking. I just start going and I'll stick to this script. But Siobhan, if you can go to the next slide again, I'll highlight a little bit more on scoping, because that is the most important part. So what we're trying to do, as I mentioned earlier in scoping, is figure out what your assessment is. And the reason why we ask at Enterprise, you know, what has brought you here, is because there's ways to scope things that would be counterintuitive to why you're here. So HITRUST doesn't certify organizations. HITRUST doesn't certify people. They don't certify products. What HITRUST certifies is implemented systems. So if you have something that's in development, it couldn't be certified. Now, quick rabbit hole I'll dive into is that doesn't mean you shouldn't look to bring in help to insert HITRUST into the development process, because that would make life easier. So it's never too early to bring in help to get through the process. We just can't certify you until it's actually in production. So keeping in mind that it's all about implemented systems, if you have a contract that says, hey, you need to have system Z certified, but you don't put system Z in scope, because again, it's not every single one of your systems, then that system is not going to be certified. So there's nuances to scoping to make sure that we're meeting the business objectives of actually getting certified. And that's really why it is the single most important step of the whole process, is because if we get to the certification state and you didn't certify, or we didn't certify the right systems or the right facilities, or maybe we omitted something within the risk profile, that's going to have down the line effects. It's going to have, it's going to generate issues for the whole purpose of getting certified.
Ryan, can I jump in and just give a quick example? This is a true story. We have an organization that went all the way through the end, had their validator report, and then looked at a contract. It was the contract that required them to get HITRUST certified, and there was very specific language in the contract that said they needed to get certified as a, I'm just looking, as a payer, an organization type, you know, as opposed to a covered entity or a business associate, and they had not gotten the correct certification. So it ended up being okay, but there could be very specific contractual language that you have to look for and you have to consider when you're going through all of those scoping conversations. So.
Without a doubt. I mean, it's not easy, but it's so important. So we had one question come in from the registration talking about level of effort. And I think this slide speaks to it a little bit. So I mentioned it's a significant emotional event, right? And again, I'll probably mention it several times more. The assessment is going to touch really every facet of the organization. So HR, There's questions about hiring and termination procedures, facilities, legal, compliance, finance. There's requirements about all of that stuff. That doesn't mean that those people are going to be every single day thinking about HITRUST and, you know, having to score and add comments and add evidence. That's not the case. Normally, the way that we suggest our clients structure the project is there should be one point of contact for information to kind of be funneled through, like a project manager on the client side. We have it similarly on our side. If you look at our team, look at the slide on the left, you'll see we assign you a project manager, and then there's a team of consultants kind of behind that project manager who are going to work with you in different facets based on kind of the skill set that's in question. You know, we will have network people working with your network people. We'll have, you know, more administrative assessors working with HR and, you know, things like that. So we've structured our process where like groups are working directly together. But on the client side, on the side of the organization that's being assessed, really that project manager is someone who's trying to herd cats. That doesn't mean they're doing all the work. If they do all the work, that is likely going to be their only job. But they're going to have to work with a bunch of different people throughout the organization to get this work done. Generally, we hold weekly meetings to keep everybody in the loop and project on track and moving forward. We structure it in a way where you know what the deliverables are before they're due. And it's also a forum for you all to ask us questions or ask guidance and things of that nature. So it's very fluid, not unlike other projects, you know, whether you're implementing technology or, you know, a new HR system or anything like that. Level of effort will depend really on the complexity of your assessment, the size of your organization, and some other factors. But it's doable. You know, we have clients that, you know, revenue in the billions, and we have certified clients where there was 2 people in the entire organization, a husband and wife team. They did the whole thing for their company on their own. So it's very scalable. It's definitely doable, but it takes some focus and attention. And that leads me probably to my last point on this slide, and then I'll ask Melissa if she has any comments, is you need a project champion. There has to be someone, not this project manager, not this point of contact in your organization, likely somebody on the executive team that is the champion for this project, because it's such a significant emotional event, because it takes work really from the whole organization. People are just, they've got other jobs. They wear other hats. Nobody's job is HITRUST. So there needs to be this champion who is likely someone who can make decisions in the organization, apply resources, and can influence people. So that would be, you know, one tidbit of something to take away is have a funnel point for all information to divvy out to the rest of the organization, but also have that champion in the organization that is working with the project manager to make sure it stays on track. Melissa, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to, like this slide, I think it's really, it shows the team makeup, but one thing you can't really see, the relationships that develop between these 2 teams. We at Enterprise Health, I know we keep the same assessors assigned. So, you know, we saw that very, you know, detailed slide about the different phases. And when you get to readiness assessment and you're remediating gaps, your first adoption review, where we're assessing compliance to the framework, that same assessor will stay with you until submission. You develop those relationships and you understand what the business is doing. You understand the scope of the assessment so that when you get to testing, you know, we know all of the questions, we know the answers, we have all of that information, and there's a really close working relationship between both sides of this, both sides of the team.
I wanted to let you guys know we've had a couple of questions about systems and services hosted in the cloud. And we actually have a poll question. So I don't know if you, we want to do the poll and then you can talk about that. And well, and actually while we're on this, we just got another question. It's what aspects of the process do your clients find most surprising or do not really expect or plan for upfront? It seems like it should go with this slide. So one of you wants to answer that?
I have a thought, but Melissa, anything?
Go ahead, and then I'll add.
Yeah, so and again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think my experience, most of our clients are surprised by how how rigorous the process is. Because we, I talk a lot with people kind of on the front end during the sales process, and they tell me all the time, oh, well, we're ISO certified and we've done SOC 2 and we've done this and that. And I'm like, well, it's not the same. They're like, oh no, it'll be fine. And then, 2 or 3 months into the project, they're like, holy crap, you're right. This is a lot harder. It's different. There's a lot more work. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more work, but it's more meticulous in they're asking for very specific things. Mm-hmm. They're looking at a lot of different areas as well, which some of the other certifications and frameworks may not touch on as much. And they're looking, as Melissa said in the maturity level slide, is they're looking for very specific language in your policies and procedures that express management intent. The organization shall do X, the organization will do Y. And if that's not on your policy, then we can't give you 100%. So you're going to change, you're going to have to edit your policies and procedures. You're going to have to get them back through the approval process and then republish to the organization, because as Melissa said, it's not enough just to post your policy somewhere. You have to tell people that it's been updated. That's what HITRUST expects to see. So I think for me, that's the one thing that always kind of is consistent is people are like, wow, this is more meticulous than I kind of expected.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to, the path I was headed down as well. It's that initial shock when you do the readiness assessment, our scores. A lot of organizations feel like they have this in place and they think that their maturity is a little further along than what we do. And, conversations with the customer, they'll say, well, my process, what do you mean? It says I review the contract. And when you say, but how do you review the contract, or who reviews the contract? What is included in the, you ask these kind of questions and they'll rattle it off in their head. They're like, we do this, and this. And you call attention to the fact that, but it's not documented. I can't read that. You're doing it. Now you have to document each one of those steps so that the assessors can see it and test against it. So.
Yeah, okay. I guess I'm sorry, Siobhan, my last comment to round this out is we get a lot of feedback from HITRUST where it's very clear that implications and assumptions are not really allowed. They're not acceptable. Like you can't really rely on a gray area. It needs to be very deliberate and direct and clear. So if someone picked up that policy, they're a brand new employee, and they picked up that process, they would know what to do because it's written there. Now, that doesn't say it needs to be 18 pages long, step-by-step with screenshots and stuff like that, but it needs to be to a level where a brand new employee who's coming in can understand it and know what they're supposed to do.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to move to the poll question. We do have a couple more questions, so I'll do the poll next if you guys want to explain it.
Yeah, so this poll question, we get a lot of questions because really everybody's kind of migrating to the cloud. How does this apply to cloud services? And the bottom line is that it applies. It's very much applicable actually, and HITRUST has accounted for that in a couple different ways. So if you're a data center or you're utilizing AWS or Azure or something like that, you have to account for the work that AWS and Azure does. And again, that sounds really counterintuitive. You're like, but I don't manage that. Like I have no control over what they're doing. I'm just renting space, so to speak. Well, it doesn't matter to HITRUST because that's where your data is. And you still have a fiduciary responsibility to protect that data, even though it's living somewhere else. So you're required to show that your hosting providers are meeting the same rigor and the same criteria that you would be required to demonstrate if you were an on-prem data center. So the other piece of it that HITRUST offers you is all the big cloud providers are already HITRUST certified. So HITRUST has developed this program called the Inheritance Program, where you can actually pull in the work that they did to demonstrate their compliance to the requirements that you personally don't manage or control. So a lot of it's around physical security, disaster recovery, business continuity, things of that, lots of network stuff, transmission. So you would pull a lot of that information from them, and you would pull their scores, alleviating you from, having to harass AWS or Azure or, whomever else. So it's definitely scalable. It's definitely flexible in the sense that, HITRUST realizes that depending on the size of your organization, you may not be able to move the big cloud providers. So they've worked in some workflows there.
Yeah. And just to piggyback on that, Ryan, as you said, you can inherit many of those controls, but there are some that you definitely cannot inherit as well. So you can't rely completely on the cloud service provider. There are certain things that you have to do and be responsible for in your organization. So it's never 100% inheritable.
Yeah, and I guess to make it more clear, or to drive the point home is probably a better way of putting it, is there's usually some kind of residual responsibility. Take physical security. If you're working with AWS, you're like, well, my data's in their data center. They manage all the physical security, but you probably have an office space, and the physical security of that office space, because you have a network there and you have endpoints there and you have people there and you have data there, is still required. So there is still some residual responsibility. There are some that are 100% inheritable,
right? But
generally, if your plan is to just inherit everything because you're completely cloud-based, it's not going to work out really well, because there's a lot of times, probably better than 3/4 of the time, there's some kind of residual responsibility where you're still going to have to demonstrate your compliance to it.
Especially like in the education domain, you still have to onboard the workforce. You still have to provide training. All of those things are going to be done at an organizational level, not by your cloud service provider.
Yep.
You did get a question on changes to federal regulations, what's anticipated and how HITRUST is addressing that. I don't know if you want to do that next.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk lately, specifically in healthcare, around the Cures Act, and what is HITRUST doing, and how can healthcare organizations leverage HITRUST to do that. HITRUST actually just announced that they've established, and I want to bring it up because it's still somewhat new. They've worked with ENAC to set up this Trusted Network Accreditation Program. So it's a partnership between HITRUST and ENAC, where it'll satisfy things like the Cures Act, the requirements there from a security and privacy perspective, by utilizing your HITRUST certification. So what I can do is I'll put a link in the chat box to that program, so you can look at that and see if it applies. But yeah, I mean, that's an example of what HITRUST is doing, as a probably more broad and general comment. As new legislation comes out, whether at the federal or state level or even international level, HITRUST updates the CSF to reflect that. So right now there's 4 versions available of the CSF, 9.1 through 9.4. Most of those micro releases were released because there was a new state law that came out, or the one going from 9.3 to 9.4 was all about CMMC for the Department of Defense. So they are constantly staying on top of anything that changes, not only in the existing regulations and frameworks that they've brought into this framework, but anything that's new that's coming out. So you can expect them to publish something pretty quickly, you know, relatively speaking, to update the CSF to make sure it captures anything that's new.
You also got a question on does HITRUST really, getting HITRUST certified allow us to avoid audits and questionnaires from customers?
The answer is yes. I mean, that was one of the biggest selling factors for HITRUST for a really long time, is that assess once, report many. We've gotten feedback from a lot of our clients that once they got their HITRUST certification report, they were able to provide that to business partners, and the business partners accepted that.
Okay. And you got another one, and I know we're kind of winding down, so I just want to make sure we get all the questions in. How has the big move to employees working remotely impacted HITRUST?
That's a great question, and something that I'm sure Melissa has some comments on this, that we've obviously had to figure out and somewhat overcome in the past year. So it doesn't specifically impact your certification or your ability to get certified, but there's definitely some nuances. And probably the most obvious example is wireless, right? So previous slide, we showed you the 19 domains. Domain 5 is wireless. So most organizations have some kind of wireless network or networks at their office space, which are required to meet certain criteria. Well, a lot of those places are now closed and people are working from home. So the question is how do I force my employees to, you know, make sure they have AES 256 enabled on their home wireless router? And there's definitely some nuance there. HITRUST doesn't expect you, nor is it really feasible for you to configure home routers, depending on the size of your organization, especially to make sure they meet that criteria. So generally, those things are somewhat scoped out, but the endpoint that person is using, even if it's, whether it's company issued or even BYOD, there's still requirements that you'll have to demonstrate you're compliant, or demonstrate that those endpoints are compliant too. So there's a little bit of nuance. There's a little bit of a learning curve that we've all gone through. We've gone back to HITRUST with a lot of different scenarios, and they've, you know, rendered verdicts on them. So it's had an impact, but it's not insurmountable.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add, there are specific requirements around remote workers or workers who telework. And one of the biggest things that we've seen is that, and I want, you know, it's getting more and more common. Obviously, it's very common within the past year, but it used to be on an exception basis. And we saw a lot of organizations that had to do a bulk kind of push of those teleworking training or acknowledgements, or they do internal checks to ensure that they have the appropriate workspace. So that is one common thing that we did see, this massive push to make sure that all of the employees received and acknowledged the telework security controls. Yeah.
I think the only other thing that I'm thinking about a little more is one of the probably the biggest impact, and it's more from as an external assessor than perhaps the person being, or the entity being assessed, is HITRUST has alleviated the need or the requirement to actually do on-site testing since the pandemic hit. So pretty much since last March, we haven't done any go on site and actually do physical testing. We've done it all virtually. So that's a bit of a change, especially for us, but for our clients as well, because they have to do virtual walkthroughs. In some cases, we've sent one person to the office with a camera as we were walking through, asking, hey, show me the fire extinguisher, show me the locks on the doors, show me the network closets. So that's probably a big change based on what's going on with remote working, and who knows what organizations will do with going back to office space. But yeah, that's definitely been an impact.
Yeah, but not there has been but not something we hadn't seen with the big shift towards cloud-based service providers as well. Some organizations don't have a physical office, so definitely controls to address that though.
Yep, without a doubt.
I'm going to put up the last poll question while you guys do your wrap up, because I know we're going to running low on time. So I don't know if anybody else has questions or anything else that people are interested in talking about or hearing about.
So as the poll's being answered, we did have a question towards the beginning. It says, can the HITRUST cert with SOC 2 be used as official SOC 2 requirements for data center? I'm not super clear on the question being asked, but what I'll do is I'm going to put it in the chat box now. HITRUST has an entire webpage dedicated to the partnership that they have with SOC 2 providers and stuff like that. So hopefully that will answer your question more directly than me trying to fumble around with it right now. The other thing that I'm going to throw into the chat box is a link to the Trusted Network accreditation program, which goes back to our question about the CARES Act and some of the federal regulations that are coming out. Any other questions based on any information we presented?
So we do have some resources on our website, articles, checklists, things like that. We have, as Ryan mentioned before, we have webinars that are specifically on scoping, if anybody's interested in those, and feel free to reach out to Ryan or Melissa. Yeah,
so just in closing, one, I appreciate everybody hanging out and weathering the storm that was this presentation. I hope you found it insightful. As Siobhan mentioned, feel free to reach out to me with any questions, scoping questions, clarification questions, anything like that. I'm very available. To me, like, HITRUST is what I do every single day. I care about people doing it and doing it well, so I'm more than happy to answer any of those questions. Melissa, I want to thank you for joining me on this, and Siobhan, thanks for putting this whole thing together.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks everybody for attending.